Don't worry, it's not all doom and gloom this week. We'll get into all of that later. Welcome, everyone, here to Full Circle, Florida. First up this week, Washington's annual Game of Chicken. What happens when D.C. politicians play games on America's dime? And can Florida keep banking on the federal government to do its job, or do we need our own game plan? We lead off this week with Tallahassee correspondent Forrest Saunders. Forrest, thanks for joining us. This week a PR person from one of the congressmen called me. He wanted to come on the show and talk about who's to blame for the government shutdown. And I said, I've got better things to do than to waste the viewers' time with the same old rap, because I knew it was going to be. I mean, they would come on, blame the other side. And I just feel like it's a dishonest conversation. At the end of the day, just do your job, get to work instead of looking for the nearest camera. I remember when I was a reporter in Raleigh, North Carolina, and I know you know how this works. You spend a lot of nights at the state capitol burning the midnight oil, waiting on them to get their act together. Democrats and Republicans, they couldn't agree on a budget bill for the state. And you know what happened? They kicked the media out. We had to sit outside for hours writing 3 different versions of a story. We didn't know how it was going to turn out, but they had a select few from both sides. They went into the state speaker's office. They puffed on cigars. They drank whiskey, and they emerged from a smoke-filled room at 3 a.m. and abracadabra, they announced, guess what? We've got a deal. Why can't they do that in D.C.?
Why can't they do it in Florida? I mean, we had a budget battle here over a period of months, right? We went into extra innings, severely extra innings, in order to get a budget deal done. And this was it with a GOP supermajority in both chambers and a friendly governor. I mean, performative politics and the demand to try and own your opponent has really gotten out of control, I think, in this country. And I think that what we're seeing play out on the national scale is sort of a symptom of that. We've become a very polarized nation. And that's one of the reasons why it's really hard for Congress to function right now, is because everybody wants to get on social media and score points on the other side. And so until we actually have some real repercussions for the vast majority of the electorate here in America, I don't think that Congress is going to really feel inspired to act. You got everybody that is pointing fingers right now. They are saying it's the other side that's to blame. But I think the voters will be the final say in this, because we do have the midterm elections coming up right around the corner. And, I think voters are watching and waiting. And if they start to feel actual impacts from this, they may actually take a side, and we might get some action from Congress. But until then, we're sitting on pins and needles as reporters waiting to find out what happens.
I got about 30 seconds left, Forrest. Where does this leave the state of Florida? Is there a push in Tallahassee for the state to be less dependent on Washington to do its thing? I mean, even if they get a deal, when they get a deal done, because they will, as they always do, doesn't this underscore the need for Florida to be a little bit more independent from Washington?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. And I think everybody wants that. If it's Democrats who are saying, we need to get away from just the hyper-partisan attitude of the White House, or if it's Republicans saying we need to be charting our own fiscal policy because we are different than most other states. Yeah, I think everybody agrees on that. But the question of what to spend those dollars on, that remains to be seen, and how to use the state budget, considering, hey, we are in uncharted territory with the economy. These tariffs are weighing heavy on everybody. What is it going to do to tourism here? Man, I don't know. So it's going to be an interesting legislative session, I'll say that, in 2026.
It would be nice if the states, or rather the federal government, had the same rules as the states. The states are legally obligated to pass a budget, and they have to get it done one way or the other. Forrest Saunders, as always, appreciate you stopping by.
We'll see you.
It's the movie we're all forced to watch every year. Both political parties blaming each other for a budget standoff, and we all know the ending. One side eventually caves, and everyday Americans end up paying the price. So who gets the gain and who feels the pain this time? Here's my conversation with Jacob Reyes from Axios, Tampa Bay. It looks like, Jacob, we do one of these almost every year at this point. It's become an annual tradition of sorts in America. I don't know why. But how does a government shutdown, even the threat of one, because we're going to run into this again, even if this thing is solved, we're going to hit it again in a few months or a year from now. How does it impact people in Florida?
Right. Well, about 95,000 federal workers in Florida could be affected. And these are, across many different agencies, including, the Department of Defense, military personnel, but also the National Hurricane Center. I mean, there are a decent amount of federal employees who can get immediate effects. But also, I think it's worth noting that one of the things that's at the top of the demands from Democrats in Congress right now are ACA subsidies, Affordable Care Act subsidies that specifically affect Florida. I think in Tampa Bay, it was 525,000 people are at risk of seeing their health insurance premiums rise by over 88% if these subsidies are not extended.
You know, it's just striking how we keep finding ourselves replaying the same old movie. Why do we find ourselves here? And can we ever get back to the days of, Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, going out to dinner after they hashed things out and negotiating and figuring out the deal and it not coming to an actual government shutdown?
I think what you see here is just this growing partisan divide that has been growing, year after year, and now it's like this giant impasse and abyss. I feel between the two parties, and really, it's the American people who are most affected by this. But we're seeing this play out all the time. I mean, we see current events happen, on live television and just have completely different views on it. It's really more than just a difference of opinion. It's a difference of reality at this point.
Yeah, I mean, both sides do have pretty clear priorities, and they're not lining up at all, Republicans and Democrats. And each time we come to this brink of a government shutdown, both sides, both parties can be perceived as being incompetent by the American people. In fact, the new Gallup poll suggests that Americans they're tired of the finger pointing, the political rhetoric. But is there one party or the other that could emerge from this with more wounds and bruises? Or do both sides have something to lose here as we do creep closer to the midterms? Will voters remember this?
I think that Democrats have faced a lot of flack, I think, for not being a very effective opposition to Donald Trump. And I think a lot of their supporters have wanted to see a bit more decisive action from them, a bit more show of strength. So I think to some degree, them sticking to their guns here would almost serve as a boon for some of their base, which we know that they've had trouble inspiring their base to make it out to the polls. Now, in terms of Republicans, I think, historically, the party that is in power typically, gets punished, I think, in the midterms. So obviously Trump is trying to combat that, and it's certainly going to continue to be this kind of messaging war. But I think that if Democrats, hold down the fort, I think they could certainly draw some benefits.
Yeah, the question of both sides sticking to their guns and managing not to shoot themselves in the foot come 2026. It's a political calculated risk. Jacob Reyes, as always, thank you for your insight.
Thank you.
Next on Full Circle Florida, is American democracy slipping away? I dive deep with USF professor Joshua Scacco. Welcome back to Full Circle Florida. If you watched me here last week, I did a whole segment on what's right with America. There is a lot of good in this country that we tend to forget about. In fact, one could argue we take it for granted. One of those good things, democracy itself. Most of us probably think it's always going to be there. Elections, free speech, private property, the right to bear arms, the justice system. However you define it, democracy in America is not a given. And it's also not exactly the same from decade to decade. So what is the road going to be like ahead? I'm joined next by USF professor and the founding director of the Center for Sustainable Democracy, Joshua Scacco. All right, let's talk about democracy's sort of shape-shifting nature across time. To give a little deeper context here, democracy's always been sort of a fluid concept. 1940s, World War II, you had rationing, you had media censorship back then.
Yep.
The government directing reporting, that was kind of the norm, yet it was framed as defending freedom, and for understandable reasons. The context does matter. How has the lived experience of democracy evolved from different eras of American history? Because democracy 200 years ago in this country is not the same as the one that we've shared in our lifetimes. It does matter the time that you're living in.
One of the stories of American democracy is that it has expanded over time in the sense of when you have a small group of individuals at the founding of our republic who can vote and participate in terms of public life, white landowning men. And then that expands over time in terms of the people who can vote and participate in American life. And so, yes, the meaning of democracy changes in the sense of who participates, who engages. But what doesn't change is that foundational understanding that power in a society like ours is vested with people. And so what that means is we give that over to political leaders when we elect them. And so that is the constant here. The arguments over things like taxation, over the size of government, over environmental regulation, any sort of litany of policy issues that we can think of, all of that is essentially on top of the bedrock of what we think of when we think of democracy, the processes that are in place, and the ways in which people are given a voice in that process. And I think that's really important here.
The risk of slipping into authoritarianism, there's been a lot of talk about that of late, given the current political climate, rising polarization, disinformation, institutional distrust. Are we witnessing this gradual slide toward authoritarianism in America, or is this a cyclical stress test for democracy itself?
One of the challenges that we do see at this moment, as you're mentioning, is there are dynamics in place that work against a functioning democracy. So political polarization, so partisan extremity, not being able to potentially see opposing political arguments, engage with them, engage in sort of conversations with even our neighbors, our family members, our friends. I think we've all experienced some of what this can look like and how damaging it can be to us individually and to our communities. When you look, for instance, at the spread of bad content, dis and misinformation and those types of things, that eats away at the decision-making capacity of people in a democracy. When you look at institutional trust, by electing people to office, we're also entrusting them with essentially our virtue as individuals, as citizens. So all of these things eat away at sort of democratic life. And what that does is that creates conditions for political leaders to essentially come in and say that, well, all of these other sources in a society that you might rely on for your content, for your news and information, whether that might be the research that comes out of universities, the news that's produced and distributed by journalists, all of that cannot be trusted. Trust me. And that's where we start to get into some dangerous situations as a democracy.
Let's talk about the media's role, because I have my own thoughts. I mean, obviously I'm in the business. The business, as they say. But as we saw with CBS, we saw with Jimmy Kimmel, media is a business. It's a profit-making machine. And you can say, that it's fragmented and that everyone with an X account is media these days. But if you're talking about the kind of big league journalism that takes an army of lawyers and millions of dollars to finance and back up and defend in court, like the expose that was done that broke the story about the Epstein files, which was first broken by a reporter at the Miami Herald. You're going to need an apparatus in place. You need more than money for the media to stand on. You need a government that believes in the freedom of press. What are your thoughts on that right now?
If we look at the dynamic here, what we're talking about is the use of state power on independent sources of information and content in a society, and the exertion of that state power here. So when the Federal Communications Commission, for instance, threatens the licenses of broadcast news outlets over the types of coverage that they're giving to political leaders, that is state power being used to try to bring journalists to heel in a lot of ways. That's problematic. That's problematic from a constitutional perspective in terms of First Amendment freedom of press issues. That's also problematic because what we see in other places in the world is when state power is used against journalists, it oftentimes is also used against other people, everyday individuals in a society, civil society organizations who also are independent kind of stores of information, universities, other sort of nonprofits. And so the idea here is that you weaken these independent stores of information in a society, and that way political leaders can centralize the control of information.
And people should understand this kind of thing doesn't happen overnight like that.
It doesn't.
It's a second hand on the clock. It's a little and before you know it, it's here, and you didn't see it happen. It takes years.
The metaphor that's oftentimes used is the frog that's put in basically a pan of water on a stove, and the water is slowly heated up to the point where the frog doesn't realize that they're essentially boiled. Right. And that's where the eating away of these particular rights is that sort of democratic backslide away from democracy.
Let's talk about the Trump administration. One day this country is going to elect a Democrat. The pendulum always swings back the other way. And when that happens, they may or may not look at the precedent that the Trump White House has established and that the Supreme Court has allowed, which is basically maximize your power right up to the limit or past the limit of the Constitution. Is that a game that we're in now when the scales shift back the other way? Is it going to be a different kind of erosion of rights? Or do the American people have a voice with their vote to say enough, play it down the middle, or get out of the way? Because that's where most of America is. Still, to this day, there's a vast gap and there's a demand there that's not being met by either party.
One of the big challenges that we've seen is because of things like political polarization, that Congress, for instance, has become more politically polarized amongst its members. So what that means is they're less likely to pass significant pieces of legislation. And so what that does in those particular circumstances, and we see this with a government shutdown right now, what we see is presidents who are elected on taking action try to step in on unilateral ways in which they can govern without Congress. So we're seeing this with Donald Trump. We've seen this, though, with a successive string of presidents, Republicans and Democrats, in terms of the president trying to enhance their power, their political power. And the one kind of story I always think about is it's essentially executive power or presidential power is like a rubber band. You expand it, and it never goes back to where the rubber band was previously. And that I think in a lot of ways is a threat to what we think about with checks and balances amongst the courts, Congress, and the president. Is you don't want any one branch of government becoming too powerful. The whole idea is they keep them in check.
Once you set that precedent, it's there.
It's there.
All right, I got 10 seconds left. I hate to make this a yes or no, but will technology, AI, is that going to save us, Josh? Give me something, to be positive about.
Technology is the great facilitator for human behavior.
Could be the equalizer, maybe. It depends on how you use it.
It could be the equalizer. It could also potentially be the downside in these circumstances.
We all have a responsibility in this great American experiment. Joshua Scacco, thank you for being here.
Thanks.
As always, appreciate it. Full Circle Florida continues right after this. Thank you for watching us here on Full Circle Florida. We hope you'll join us again next week, and make sure to add our free 24/7 streaming news channel, Tampa Bay 28 Plus. We'll see you again next week. Take care.